Well, thanks for the invitation. It's very exciting for me to be here and learning about the research that's going on. So this is going to be a talk about mystical experience. The recent work on mystical experience uses questionnaires that have been developed from the works of these two philosophers. Rather than just plunge straight into the mystical experience questionnaires, I'm just going to do a little bit of unpacking and refining of what James called marks of mystical experience, starting with James and Stace. And the point of this is perhaps just to make a fresh start with a view to perhaps looking at ways in which the mystical experience questionnaires might be supplemented. So James didn't think you could actually analyze the concept of a mystical experience. He thought that you just had to give marks of mystical experience. It's like a kind of what philosophers call a cluster concept. To have the concept in question is to have many, but not necessarily all, of certain marks in question. And James came up with 4 marks. The most important one, I think, is what he called the noetic quality. And that has to do with, he unpacks it in various ways. So the first thing that I've got here says that the experience seems to reveal direct knowledge of truths not normally discovered through sense perception and reason. So these are the kind of metaphysical truths, what seems to be metaphysical knowledge. So perhaps one important mark of mystical experience is that it seems to reveal this kind of metaphysical knowledge directly. Then other features, that the content seems to the person having the experience to be subjectively completely certain. They often say it's more certain to them than anything else that they've ever believed. And they also seem to think that the experience itself justifies belief in the content. So those are closely connected marks, the unpacking of what James means by the noetic quality. He also says that the experience seems to be about something profoundly valuable or divine. So these are also far cognitive conditions, cognitive marks of mystical experience. The next one, that they seem paradoxical. Content seems paradoxical. That's something that we get from Stace. And the idea here is that often the content seems to combine contradictory things, like you might have an experience in which you seem to merge with something and become it, yet you remain distinct from it. So there's that kind of paradoxical element to it. Still cognitive, perhaps, is that it seems ineffable. The experience, well, ineffable, strictly speaking, means that it can't be described. But I think a best way of capturing what they really mean by this is that at least it contains elements that can't be adequately described in language. Typically, there are some elements which do get described in language, seemingly adequately enough. So those are all cognitive conditions. And now we get to some which I think of as phenomenological. So the idea that they seem greatly significant is, I'm understanding it here as a purely phenomenological condition. You get the sense that the experience was profoundly meaningful. Never mind whether it actually had a content that seems meaningful to you, but having the experience itself was an enormously meaningful experience. Then a couple of conditions James offers. He says that another mark is these experiences are transient. And by that, he seems to mean that they are brief duration, maybe minutes, seconds, minutes, but about that kind of duration. He also talks, the other mark that James introduces is the idea that they're passive. And by that, he seems to mean not just that they befall you, that's obvious for any experience, but rather that it makes voluntary action during the experience difficult. It's difficult to actually sort of exercise your will when you're under the effect of this experience.
Totally failing to do this backwards.
Because that's saying.
What are you trying to do?
Not everybody.
People are joining late on live, so we have to let them in.
Okay, so if I see a little So other phenomenological marks, that it involves a loss of the usual sense of time and space. Feelings of unity, that's a very important mark. Feelings of blissfulness and embodying universal love. Those are all phenomenological marks. But again, all of these marks are things that are not necessary conditions for the experience, but if you've got enough of them, then according to James, you've got a mystical experience. Stace himself prefers to say that there are, I believe it was 7 categories, and you had to have all of them, so they were all necessary conditions. He wound up, therefore, with a very narrow conception of mystical experience. But I think it's better to work with a broader one, along the lines that I just suggested. So now I'm going to just mention some of the reported benefits of mystical experience. Just read these out. A sense of one's life having meaning. A reduction in anxiety, most importantly in fear of death. Increased sense of being connected to other people. Increased curiosity and openness to experience. Expanded tendency to find delight in the world. Increased gratitude for one's life. And increased self-acceptance. Those are all things that I think of as kind of personal benefits. And then it's also suggested that these experiences can have ethical benefits. And first one of these perhaps is a reduction in narrow self-interest. That could be thought of as a motivational disposition. The others are, if you like, emotional dispositions, that you have an expanded love towards others, you have reduced anger towards others, and greater compassion and empathy. So before getting on to discuss these effects, I'll just say a few words about causes. And mystical experiences are known to arise spontaneously, by which is usually meant for no apparent reason. We might think there's a reason, but we just can't figure out what it is. Sometimes as a result of meditation, sometimes as a result of some extreme physical or psychological duress, breathing techniques, drumming, I've heard, is also a possibility. And often and most reliably through psychedelic drugs, which is what this unit has been focused on here. So how can one study mystical experiences? Well, one kind of study would be to look at autobiographical and biographical accounts of people who've had these experiences and see how it's affected their whole life. That gives you an interesting kind of holistic account of what's going on. So that's one way of investigating. Another is to look at the wide range of reports that have been put forward by people who've had these experiences. So those can be found in numerous books, and these days in lots of websites. I could mention a few later on if people are interested. So one way you could try to approach the study is to look at all these reports and do some kind of content analysis of them. You can either do it sort of humanly by hand, or, because that's a very slow way of doing it if you've got many reports, or you can try to use some kind of AI algorithm to do it. And I think the jury's still out on how successful they are. Obviously, there can be some advances in that. But another drawback of these studies is that few of these reports actually say much about the lasting effects. They're mostly descriptions of just what happened in the moment. So if you're interested in the effects, you really are more inclined to need studies that solicit data rather than just analyze existing data. So one kind of study that solicits data, retrospective studies, solicit reports of people who've had mystical experiences. The advantages of this is that you can get a lot of participants and you can compare experiences with different causes. Another kind solicits volunteers for real-time inducement of these experiences, typically through psychedelics. By psychedelics, I mean hallucinatory and other consciousness-expanding drugs. And most commonly studied ones are psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and mescaline. Well, one complication of studying mystical experiences this way is how you distinguish the effects of the mystical experiences that are effects of the mystical experiences rather than effects of other experiences from the psychedelics. Because psychedelics have been known to give rise to, aside from mystical experiences, they've been known to give rise to, well, of course, famously, the sort of aesthetic experiences that attract many people to it. Also psychotic experiences, the so-called sort of bad trips. And also you can have personal insights that come from psychedelics, where sort of deep memories bubble up from the unconscious. And they can be very insightful. But they're personal rather than universal, which is the nature of a mystical experience. So there can be many other kinds of experiences you get through psychedelics. And if you're interested in studying the mystical experiences, then you need some way to distinguish the effects that come from the mystical component rather than the other components. But they have great advantages that you can induce fairly reliably a mystical experience and quite quickly from these from psychedelics. Plenty of willing participants again. And it doesn't rely on distant memories like the retrospective ones do. And also there's some advantage to having a relation to brain chemistry. If you know precisely what the drug is that somebody is getting, then it helps forge links to neuroscience. So the first, now get on to the experiments. The first one I want to talk about is just the famous seminal experiment by Walter Planck. And this was written up as a PhD dissertation in '63. The experiment was conducted in '62, I believe. And what he did was he got 20 divinity students as volunteers and divided them into two groups. Half of them received a dose of psilocybin and half received some sort of active placebo. And this was prior to attending a Good Friday service in Boston University's Marsh Chapel. So it's sometimes known as the Good Friday experiment, sometimes the Marsh Chapel experiment. And he picked this idea of the divinity students in this religious context to mimic the use of peyote in religious contexts. So what they had to do, these people, the participants, was they had to complete questionnaires before the experiment, a few days after, and then 6 months after. They also wrote individual accounts of their experience, and they were interviewed, and all that was analyzed. So these questionnaires, or the developments from them, came to be known as mystical experience questionnaires and persisting effects questionnaire. And the metaphysical mystical experience questionnaire, at least Anker's first one, which he started off with about 100 questions, and it was eventually sort of reduced to a sort of standardized 43, which is known as the MEQ 43. And then it got further reduced to the MEQ 30. But he based his original questions on Stacy's categories, categories of unity, transcendence of space and time, deeply felt positive mood, sense of sacredness, objectivity and reality, paradoxicality, and alleged ineffability. And then there was lastly one category from James, transiency. And the persisting effects questionnaire contained, well, many questions that he thought up himself, along the lines of the ones that I've got on the handout. So his conclusions, well, the mysticism finding was that all 10 of the participants who received the psilocybin, they scored significantly higher than the control group on all 8 categories of the mystical experience questionnaire. Perhaps not that very surprising, but it's worth seeing that that actually did occur. And he said that 4 out of 10 had what he called a complete mystical experience. So this idea of a complete mystical experience was something, I think people, psychologists would call it a construct. But anyway, someone thought it was a useful construct, that in order to count as having a complete mystical experience, you had to score 60% or more on all of the categories. If it was 8 categories, on all 8. And of these 10 people who did the took the psilocybin, 4 out of 10 had complete mystical experiences. So that was the mysticism finding. Then, as far as the effects was concerned, most of the questions on the persisting effects questionnaire had significantly higher scores for those who received the psilocybin than those who didn't. Perhaps also, again, that's not terribly surprising. But interestingly, there was a 25-year follow-up to this. All 10 of those people who took the psilocybin were interviewed again 25 years later, and the effects were purported to be very similar. So they really were lasting effects. So one asset of this Planck's experiment, I think, is the thorough and extremely well thought out questions on the mystical experience questionnaire and the persisting effects questionnaire that allow for a really interesting fine-grained gathering of data. But a shortcoming of his study is that he didn't look for correlations between specific features of mystical experiences and specific benefits, which would have established a kind of defeasible presumption of causation and explanation between the feature of the mystical experience and the benefit. So his published results left few clues as to why mystical experiences were found to have lasting benefits. And he didn't even test, surprisingly, for whether there was any correlation between overall mystical experience strength and overall persisting effect or well-being. And then there was another drawback. As I said, he liked the idea of mimicking the religious context of peyote, but it's a very small homogeneous group. Of course, if you're interested in the effects of mystical experience, you want to get a large, diverse gathering of participants. And since then, there have been many other studies with different types of participants that have come to comparable conclusions. Not just with healthy subjects, but also showing beneficial effects of psychedelics on cancer patients, people with mental disorders, such as addiction and anxiety and depression. So a surprising thing to me about all these studies is that they don't look at specific features of mystical experiences, such as the ones on the handout, or Panker's 8 categories, to see if they're correlated with persisting effects. Instead, what they do is they invariably group the answers to the questions on the mystical experience questionnaire into what they call factors, between 2 and 4 factors. And then they analyze the effects for those factors. So if there are any fine-grained correlations, these studies don't find them because they're looking in a more coarse-grained way. Now I want to go to talk a little bit about retrospective studies. And an important class of these come from a database gathered by Wintering and Newberg, which consists of, it's a large database, 2,718 participants. And they were gathered from an online survey, which was advertised to just ask people to participate to explore religious and spiritual experiences. So I think that the way that the call for participants was constructed likely attracted people who'd had mild religious experiences as well as strong ones. So I think that's something to bear in mind as we go along. So what they asked these participants to do, first of all, just to fill out some kind of open text descriptions of their experiences. And then there was questions about their background and about the causes of the experience, very interesting. And also then a battery of questionnaires. And instead of giving the standard mystical experience questionnaire, they picked one which got at mysticism only through what we might think of as just one important category, which is the idea of having feelings of unity. So all the other items on the mystical experience questionnaire weren't really tested for unless they were on some other questionnaire. So 2 studies that they did from this database included linguistic analysis of the open text descriptions. One of them was quite interesting, I thought. It looked for positive and negative correlations. Between items that you could find words that came up in their texts, correlations between some of those words indicating certain kinds of marks with feelings of realness, ideas that the experience felt real. I don't think I think that has some interest to it, but I think more interesting than the experience itself feeling real, and I'm not really sure what people would mean by that, but I would be more interested in probing idea that people felt that the content of the experience, if it had a propositional content, that seemed real to them. Anyway, so that was 2 kinds of studies, but the one that interests me most is the one that I've got here on the handout. It's called Of Roots and Fruits. And the conclusion, so here's one of the conclusions that they put. I'll just read this out again. Religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences, that's RSME, those experiences that were induced with psychedelic substances were rated as being A, significantly more mystical, and B, having greater positive or existential impact than the RSMEs triggered through other means. So the idea here is that if you had your experience psychedelically, it's going to be more mystical and have more impact, more benefits perhaps, than the experiences triggered other ways, maybe spontaneously or through meditation or means. So that's their conclusion. But it seems to me as if it's quite likely that the non-psychedelic group would have had more mild experiences than the psychedelic group. Most of the psychedelic experiences that would occur would be quite powerful of the mystical experiences. So I think that it's likely that the non-psychedelic group had more mild experiences, and which would have brought down the average mysticism and impact scores for that group. So I think that their data would be compatible with the mysticism and impact scores for mystical experiences being higher for the non-psychedelic group than the psychedelic group. So they're suggesting that the psychedelic group will have greater mysticism and impact scores for RSMEs. But I'm saying if we just focus on the people who've had the mystical experiences rather than other kinds of spiritual or religious experiences, you might find that that's reversed. You might find that, for example, the spontaneous mystical experiences are more mystical and more powerful, impactful than those that come about through psychedelics. So that's something that could be tested. A remedy to that drawback, I think, would be to take the data and instead of just working with the full 2718 participants who had some kind of religious, spiritual, or mystical experience, just restrict your participants to the ones that score highly for mystical experiences. So if you just start with a mystical experience group, you can then look to see whether indeed the people who had the psychedelically caused experience had greater mysticism and greater impact than the ones who didn't. That would be, I think, an interesting thing which you could do with this existing data. Other things you could also look for correlations between specific causes. Since they've recorded what the cause is, you can look for interesting correlations to see if there are interesting correlations between causes and specific effects. It might be so the specific effect of your life being more purposeful or anxiety about death declining. It might turn out that there's an interesting correlation between the kind of cause of your experience and that sort of effect. That would be something you could do by just looking again at their raw data. Okay. So I'm suggesting that fine-grained analysis would be useful. One important reason why fine-grained analysis is needed is to address a concern that's occurred to many people, but has been made prominent by the journalist Michael Pollan. Some of you have probably come across his articles and his book. First, of course, he presented it in a New Yorker magazine article. I think it was called The Trip Treatment. But then shortly afterwards, a book called How to Change Your Mind came out in 2018. And the concern he voiced is that perhaps all these benefits that we're discovering from mystical experiences, perhaps they spring from a non-physicalist metaphysical belief that's false and serves as a comforting delusion. So the principle of such metaphysical, the non-physicalistic metaphysical beliefs you might be thinking about would be belief in God, belief in universal consciousness. And I think it's easy to see how those metaphysical beliefs would lead to a reduction in fear of death, since on those views, death isn't the end of one's individual consciousness. So how would we respond to this, what he calls the comforting delusion? You might respond that the metaphysical belief in question is in fact true. That's certainly an option which has to be explored scientifically and philosophically. Or you might respond that even if it is, the metaphysical belief is false, that that's not a serious cost. It's still beneficial. Why worry about whether the belief is false? Well, you could say that having a false such metaphysical belief could lead to maladaptive coping strategies and a mistrust of science. So there may be instrumental reasons why having a false belief is bad, but you might also think that it's intrinsically bad to have a false belief. This would be a drawback to the therapy if all the benefits come from this dubious metaphysical belief. So I think an interesting question then is that, are there benefits to mystical experiences that don't involve those non-physicalistic metaphysical beliefs? And as far as I know, until recently, the studies haven't tried to distinguish the mystical experiences that involve these metaphysical beliefs from other mystical experiences in assessing the effects. Although tantalizingly, I think, as I've already started to indicate, many of these studies have collected the raw data that would enable at least a partial assessment of the role of metaphysical beliefs. And I'm going to return to that. But I believe the first study to systematically probe the role of metaphysical beliefs in the content and impact of psychedelic experience is this one here on the handout, Psychedelics Alter Metaphysical Beliefs, 2021. Timmerman et al., and I believe that he came and gave a talk here just very recently. And so this study solicited participants to go on a psychedelic retreat with questionnaires filled out prior to the retreat and at various times afterwards. And one of these questionnaires was newly designed to precisely assess the metaphysical beliefs, along with the standard mystical experience questionnaires, and also a well-being questionnaire. And their main doxastic finding pertaining to beliefs was that the experiences tended to produce changes in metaphysical beliefs that endured after 4 weeks and 6 months, enduring changes in metaphysical beliefs, and most prominently, shifts away from metaphysical beliefs that are classified as hard materialism. In fact, he said more than half the participants had such a shift away from hard materialism towards, and then clustered together, idealism, dualism, panpsychism, and the view that there's another dimension to reality as being the non-physicalistic beliefs. So, sorry, yes, those would be the non-physicalistic beliefs. So that was the main doxastic finding, that there's this shift in beliefs. Then there's also a finding about the effects of these experiences. And their main finding with regard to the effects is shown here in figure 3 that I've reproduced on their publication. And what you see here is a scatter plot. Each point marks an individual participant. And the scatter plot is of changes in well-being up the vertical y-axis, plotted against a change in non-physicalist beliefs along the horizontal x-axis. So towards the right, you get changes towards non-physicalist beliefs. So the 0 point indicates no change. Now, one thing I noticed about this is I was a little surprised about the number of participants reporting a decrease in well-being. If you look at that 0 on the well-being scale, there's an awful lot of dots below the 0. And this to me suggests that much of the difference in well-being between, the well-being 4 weeks and 6 months later was due to other things in life, positive as well as negative, rather than just the experience. So perhaps not much of the change in well-being that's recorded here has to do with the experiment. But at least some of the change is not due to chance, as this very low p figure shows probability that it is due to chance. Okay, so now the conclusion they come to, that the line of best fit, marked, I think, yes, the line that you see drawn through the scatter plot, that demonstrates the conclusion that's that reproduced here, that shifts away from hard materialistic beliefs are associated with increases in well-being. In other words, the greater the shift towards non-physical beliefs, non-physicalistic beliefs as a result of the psychedelic experience, the greater the benefits. Okay, so that's the result, but I think it's interesting to note that at least a third of the participants reported a shift towards physicalist beliefs or no shift at all. You can see that if you take the 0 on the x-axis and look at the number of dots that are to the left of it, it's still quite a lot. I think at least a third of those participants. And then if you look again at those that are above the 0 point on the well-being scale, it seems as though a majority of those report an increase in well-being. So that suggests that some of these psychedelic experiences that occurred during the retreat had a positive causal influence on well-being that arose from some feature of the experience other than a shift towards non-physicalistic beliefs. So quite exciting, I think. This is a sign that people who had these experiences and they didn't get shifted towards non-physicalistic beliefs, some of those people who had the experiences are still reporting increased well-being. There's some benefits to them. So it might be a feature of mystical experiences, such as a feeling of unity, that's causing that well-being increase. But one has to be very cautious here, because it might be a feature of the psychedelic experience that I mentioned earlier that's not a component of mystical experience. So, for example, well, the benefits from psychedelic experiences could be just due to some kind of personal psychological insight rather than a mystical experience. And the study did not include questions that would find and potentially screen out the psychedelic experiences with personal insights. There are many questionnaires that do have that purpose. So this study doesn't give strong statistical evidence of benefits from mystical experiences that don't have a shift towards non-physicalistic beliefs. But there is plenty of independent anecdotal evidence of that. So how could one explain benefits of mystical experiences that don't involve these non-physicalistic beliefs? Well, so the things that you could look at that might have some are things that don't involve metaphysical beliefs at all. So purely phenomenological features of mystical experience, such as the ones that I had on the handout. Maybe the experience of blissfulness could be relevant. The experience of meaningfulness, experiences of love, experiences of unity. Those are all things that you might look to see whether there's an interesting correlation with benefits. Other things that might be relevant are changes in the sense of self. So one way that sense of self can change is you can have a complete loss of sense of self. That occurs with some kinds of mystical experiences, such as the pure consciousness experiences, where you pure consciousness indicates that you have no structure to your experience at all. So you certainly don't have a sense of self while having that experience. But there can also be diminished changes in sense of self, which are not complete losses, but just diminished in some sense. And one interesting way that you could have a diminished sense of self is diminished sense of agency. So one of the things that James was talking about, that you could have a sense that you don't have voluntary action becomes more difficult. That would be one way that your sense of self could change in that experience. Another way that I think that you could have a diminished sense of agency is when voluntary action doesn't actually become more difficult, but it actually becomes easier. But it doesn't seem as if the ease with which you're acting comes from your own individual desires. It just seems as if you're being guided, that you're flowing. And so that would be another interesting sense of changed sense of self, where you have a diminished sense of agency. So those are other ways that things about mystical experiences that could explain benefits. Another idea is that you could have what I'm calling here a reduced evaluative salience of the self. And that means just that your own sweet self doesn't seem as important any longer. You still know who you are. You can answer if someone calls your name. But it's just that under the experience, you've lost interest in your own particular preoccupations, perhaps as a result of a feeling of unity. But anyway, that's something which I think could be explored. It's if you like, it's a co-native rather than a cognitive sense. It's not necessarily cognitive. It could have a cognitive component, but it's really about the desires. Your own desires seem to be just in abeyance. So I put down here now a few conjectures which could be tested. And one of them is that I think that a reduced evaluative salience of the self, combined with blissfulness, might lead to benefits. And I'm just thinking here that when you have this experience for the first time of complete blissfulness, without it having anything to do with your own aspirations, that can turn out to be a very exciting revelation that could perhaps lead to long-term benefits. It might be that whenever you've felt blissful before, it's always because something you were hoping for or wishing for or trying to do came off. And so it produced the blissfulness. But then to encounter an extreme form of blissfulness that has nothing to do with your aspirations could be lead to lasting benefits. That's just one conjecture I'm putting down here. Another that there's a reduced evaluative salience of the self could lead to a reduction in selfish behavior. Just the one experience could lead to a reduction in selfish behavior into the future. And another one is that feelings of universal love might give rise to greater generosity. That's a sort of commonsensical view, but it would be interesting to have that tested empirically, to the extent that's possible. So how can one test conjectures such as these and further investigate the effects of mystical experiences that don't involve these non-physicalistic beliefs? So I've got down here sort of suggestions for how one might do that. So the first thing I think what we need to do is, with such a study, we need to divide it into two groups. Those that have, well, the first instance, we're interested in those who have mystical experiences that don't have non-physicalistic beliefs, and distinguish those from the participants that do have non-physicalistic beliefs. And I've chosen that term non-physicalistic beliefs because that's the one that Timmerman operates with. But so that could be a composite measure of non-physicalistic belief. It might be that the questionnaire is constructed from several different questions that are scored as indicating a non-physicalistic belief. But my preference would be actually to pick one salient belief that I think indicates a kind of non-physicalistic belief. And that would be that individual consciousness continues past death. I think that that one is particularly relevant because it's the one that would, I suggested earlier, obviously leads to benefits. So it'd be interesting to see if you don't have that belief, if you don't believe that your individual consciousness is going to survive your bodily death, are there still going to be benefits that we can discover? And then, so I think that that would be the one to start with. Then later on, you could go through the same procedure, dividing it into two groups for any metaphysical belief that you wish to test out. But I'm just going to talk about, run through how this might go if you're testing beliefs, a particular non-physicalistic belief. If you're doing non-physicalistic beliefs versus, sorry, if you're doing experiences that don't involve any non-physicalistic belief versus experiences that do. So ideally, you'd use some kind of metaphysical questionnaire, metaphysical belief questionnaire in this study, like Timmerman's or the ones that have been developed in Exeter here. But I think that if you don't have, if you don't have the resources to do a new study, there's still some interesting things that could be done with previously existing study, because the raw data from these previously existing studies, it includes, most of them include a battery of questionnaires, and many of them have a question like whether you believe that consciousness survives after bodily death. So you can actually find that question on the questionnaires, look at the responses, and divide your participants into those who had that belief and those who didn't. But if you don't find that kind of a question on the questionnaires, they almost all have a mystical experience questionnaire. And the mystical experience questionnaire always has a question, did you encounter ultimate reality? in your experience? Looking back on it, do you now think that your experience involved an encounter with ultimate reality? And I think that that question is a pretty good test for whether your experience embodied a metaphysical belief. Because I think that if you think you encountered ultimate reality directly through the experience, you're going to think there was some kind of metaphysical belief involved. If you had a metaphysical belief, I think you're pretty likely to say, well, it was ultimate reality that I contacted. So I think you could also divide your participants into a metaphysical belief group and a non-metaphysical belief group. So assume you've done that, you've divided your participants into two groups. You can then go for a more fine-grained approach, as I've suggested here at the bottom of the handout. So supposing you pick those who don't have a non-physicalist metaphysical belief. So those who think that consciousness won't survive bodily death. Within that group, you could pick some mark of mystical experience that you think is interesting, say a feeling of unity, and you could compare the average benefits of the mystical experiences that have that mark with those that lack it. And doing that for different marks of mystical experiences would reveal which marks are most beneficial. So you could find out which marks of mystical experience seem to be more correlated with increased well-being than others. So that would be one interesting thing you could do. Or you could pick some effect that you're interested in, some effect question such as your life is more meaningful or you're less anxious about dying. And you could compare the frequency with that effect occurs in those two groups, see whether it occurs more in one group than the other. And then you could look to see which marks of mystical experience are most highly correlated with that effect. So discovering these sorts of correlations could then help explain the benefits that arise from the mystical experiences in that group. And then you could investigate the extent to which those correlations also apply in the other group, also apply to those who believe that you'll survive bodily death. And perhaps it will even turn out that the non-physicalistic metaphysical beliefs are not the most important contributor to the value of mystical experiences. So those are a whole bunch of things that I think could be done. So to conclude, I think that, one word of caution is that all these studies come from the last 60 years or so, drawn from US and UK participants. One would like to see more diversity, obviously. Lots of statistical evidence show that mystical experiences involving the non-physicalistic beliefs have lasting benefits, not just for healthy people, but also people with cancer, people with mental disorders. It's mostly just anecdotal evidence we have of benefits of mystical experiences that don't involve these non-physicalistic beliefs. But I've suggested ways that statistical evidence could be found in new studies or in previously existing studies that could help explain why those why those particular mystical experiences can be beneficial. Okay, that's it.
Well, thank you, Noah. I'll take questions from the audience and from online, alternatively, if necessary, if that's okay. So, Irina.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting talk. It sounded to me like this thinking is based on the assumption that a mystical experience leads to benefits to mental health. Although we do increasingly have evidence as well that the mystical experience can actually lead to detrimental effects on people's mental health, which is only natural if you think of the ontological shock, which sometimes can be integrated well and lead to belief change, but it can also lead to ontological confusion and lead people to existential struggle. Is that not also a useful way of looking at the differences and how the belief change is linked to mental health, the fact that it's actually not necessarily beneficial?
Yes, so these questionnaires about persisting effects tend to have, among some of the effects will be scary ones, ones which we don't think was beneficial. So these questionnaires are designed to capture effects in general across the spectrum, but they also are interested in looking at which ones we might think of as benefit. And of course, all the excitement is that there's great potential for benefits overall. If you can just, also it's helpful to find out what is correlated with the bad effects. So it might be that there are particular kinds of, well, these days we tend to think that just getting the set and the setting fine-tuned is going to limit the number of psychotic or bad experiences. But that's, of course, another very important part of the research. And sometimes it's helpful to be able to flag the kind of individual that's at risk for having not a very good outcome. But I also think that when I was saying about diversity, it's also interesting to think about the use of these in ancient sort of Mesoamerica. So it was a sort of a very well-known ritual that people would, I think, take peyote, and often in preparation for war. So now that might be thought of as, in that culture, as something very noble. But we might not think necessarily that being primed to do battle would be a beneficial outcome. So I think there's lots of interesting contextual variables here. So definitely important, what you're suggesting.
As well as the integration after, not just the setup of the experience itself.
Yes, so indeed, the long-term effects. And one particular interesting, yes, as you say, integration, I think, especially with the metaphysical beliefs, and I think this is something more interesting. It's good to examine the effects of a careful, detached examination of the metaphysical belief afterwards, and to see to what extent the belief survives that kind of rational assessment. Some might not, some might remain, others might be completely impervious to any kind of rational assessment. Some people might be psychologically unable to engage in rational assessment of it. But yes, that's another very important thing, and I think also a very interesting avenue for research.
I'll just pick up one point. Let's say you do find causal correlations between, more fine-grained correlations between a particular experience and a particular outcome. That would be very interesting, but how would it be practiced? How could you use that? Because it would be very hard to induce a particular experience, wouldn't it? If from a psychedelic drug, you can't predict exactly what will happen when you take them. And I wonder if you've given thought to that. How might you use that fine-grained found causality?
That would be an interesting practical question. But I think, first of all, it's important to try to find out what the correlations are and see if this leads to interesting causal and explanatory hypotheses. I think that's perhaps a first step before one starts thinking about how one's going to do therapy. Yes, so of course, I'm quite interested in the retrospective accounts that look at people who've just had spontaneous experiences where there's no question about manipulation at all.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Renee?
Thanks for a great talk, Noa. I have two questions. The first is like a practical question, and the second is a hypothesis that I'd like to get your thoughts on. So the first question is, like, you speak about like either going coarse or granular with the resolution at which we're examining these beliefs, right? When you run in, how do you get around the statistical problems that you run into when you zoom in and you go more granular? And you run into the statistical problems of multiple collinearity and multiple comparison issues. That's my first question. I don't know if you just want to answer that one first.
No, this is precisely where I'm going to call on your expertise to try to help me with that. But I would think you get a good idea by just going more and more granular to the point at which perhaps, well, basically, if you've one way that you could have a coarse-grained, non-granular approach is by grouping your questions together under factors and then just analyzing what the factor scores are. So I think my thought is that if you've got the time, you could go at least as granular as going question by question. then of course you can go more granular by asking more detailed questions. But I think there are going to be certain questions where perhaps you get interesting enough results without going more granular.
I think the problem going question by question is that actually a lot of the effects are going to be multivariate. So not just going to, like, as in people's belief change profiles are multivariate. They're not just changing on one belief or another. So that's like, I think one issue with going that way. My second was like a thought to it, cerebral. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it out, but I'll try my best. So I was thinking when you spoke about I guess like the pluripotency or different potential transformations from one set of beliefs or another, like mediated by the experience, right? And I was thinking, could one way of making sense that like someone might shift to one type of a belief and someone might shift to another type of belief, but yet both might have an increase in well-being. So for me, it intuitively links into Jung's idea of individuation. And if it's like, if the experience that they have is what that individual needs in terms of like revealing a certain part of their psyche towards personal growth or reconciling their ego with the greater self, could that be a mechanism or a hypothesis as to like that? I think encompasses a lot, and I think it also encompasses potential negative transformations as well in the short term. But yeah, I don't know. I'll stop talking. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, as I suggested early on, I think you get interesting insights of a holistic nature if you look at one person and the details of their life and what's happened as a result of that experience. So that's one kind of way you could have a certain kind of insight. But the others is, I think, just to go for correlations, looking at a large number of experiences. And there I would just hope that, or be interested to see whether you get interesting correlations. It may turn out that there aren't any interesting ones, but I suspect that there will be.
Adrian, just a general question about metaphysical beliefs. So I have a suspicion that when you ask people about metaphysical beliefs, they are very often sort of articulating things they've never thought of before. So it's a bit like sort of showing them an abstract painting and saying, what do you make of this? And they'll go, yes. But do you think that people genuinely have well self-articulated metaphysical beliefs going into these things, or do they have quite loose cultural beliefs that have not really undergone any metaphysical scrutiny until the experience? And so I'm always a bit wary about sort of metaphysical shift, because you have conversations with people and ask them about their metaphysical views, and it's almost like they're sort of thinking of them on the spot relating to life experience, rather than what I wouldn't say it was a belief. It's more a sort of an occurrent thing that occurs just there and then, not a non-occurrent thing that's been there for some time.
Well, the advantage of the prospective studies is that you can run these questionnaires, get an answer to the very same question that before the experiment to after. But it's difficult, I agree, if you've got retrospective accounts. First of all, the memories can be distorted. But again, you're not really getting a sense of how they thought about the experience beforehand. Or they may try to articulate a difference for them, but it's going to be varied. I think we're going to get some people who come with perhaps a religious package of beliefs, others that really have not thought about it at all, and others who have. So I think we're just going to get a variety.
Yes.
Hi, first of all, thanks for the really interesting talk. So my question has to do with the difference between like pharmacologically and non-pharmacologically induced mystical experiences. So some people, I think it was like Alan Watts, but don't quote me on that, said that kind of like previous psychedelic use kind of like put a map somewhere for him to be easier to reach mystical experiences via kind of like meditation or other non-pharmacological means. Do we have any research available to show whether previous pharmacologically induced mystical experiences can further help facilitate future non-pharmacologically induced experiences via meditation, holotropic breathing, etc., or vice versa?
Probably, I don't know of any off the top of my head, but there are some interesting studies that look at the differences of metaphysical belief change given a psychedelically induced experience, how they differ from those who have first-time experiences from those who've had many. And it's hardly surprising that the metaphysical belief shift is much greater on average for the first-timers. Yes, there have been studies that have looked at the relationship between meditation and psychedelically induced experiences. I'm not sure which direction it went in. Whether it was first of all meditation, I think it was metaphysical belief. So psychedelic experiences in those who are long-term meditators. And I think that the idea was that it was found to facilitate their meditation on average. I could probably dig that up for you if you like.
That would be really nice.
Any more questions here? Any questions online? Okay.
So I did mention also this interesting study done of psychedelics on philosophers, which was, I think it was a Yaden study of that.
Yeah.
And then there's, so there was also an analysis of typical philosophical beliefs, what the beliefs of various philosophers and how they're dependent on how they might vary with psychedelic usage. Not very many interesting correlations were found, actually. I think there's only one or two notable ones. One rather odd one that struck me, for those of you who are philosophers, people who smoked a lot of dope tended to be Humeans about causation. I have no idea why that should be, but that is found to be a significant statistical correlation.
I've got another question for you. You heard of these so-called pseudodelics? They are some research going on at the moment to try to induce benefits from molecules based on classic psychedelic molecules, but which have no phenomenology, no experience at all. They don't induce any experience, as opposed to the idea that the experience itself is an essential causal factor in the benefits, the long-term, the later benefits. Have you thought about that at all in relation to that mental causation, for example?
Well, I thought that there's been quite a lot of research into that, and I would have thought that also that microdosing would be an interesting case in point, because you might think that the dose is not strong enough to produce a full-on mystical experience, and there's quite a lot of work has actually gone into looking at that. So I think that's an interesting debate. The little that I've seen of the results seems to suggest that you do need a mystical experience or something quite powerful to have strong psychological benefits. It's likely that, well, first of all, there are plenty of these experiences that aren't psychedelic induced. So the ones that come about spontaneously, you might think, well, there's no dose involved at all. Presumably something in the brain has happened, but we have no idea what. But what seems to produce the benefits is the psychological effect of this experience, rather than whatever it was. I mean, perhaps there might be things going on in the brain that caused it, but there might be no systematic correlation between these little brain events and the psychological events. This might be a case where it really is mental causation that's involved, and there's no interesting correlation between the mental states and any kind of underlying supervenient brain states.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be a case for mental causation? Couldn't you use psychedelic therapy as a case for mental causation if that were to be the case? You could make that. You could make the case for that, couldn't you? Unless, of course, the phenomenology is supervenient on a brain state anyway, which is the ultimate causal mechanism of the benefit.
I don't think you could use that as a case. I was making an assumption that the mental state of being in having these various marks of mystical experience won't be one-to-one correlated with any significant either physicalistic brain state or even a functional state. I think that is a separate topic. I don't think this is going to be some kind of poster case for irreducibility, but
That's research to be had, I think. Interesting essay at least.
Yeah.
Any other questions? René?
How do you think the experiences of the individual intersect with where society is at a given point in time? So, for example, we seem to be in an epoch that's like dominated by reductionism and materialism, science, trust the science, and so do you think, like, for example, in Timmerman's study, finding like an increase in non-physicalist belief, do you think that is somehow a reflection of the societal beliefs of the dominant narrative in a particular society?
I wouldn't think the dominant, if you would take the society as a whole, I wouldn't think that it would be useful to look at what's dominant in the society as a whole, but individual pockets of society. I think people who are going to volunteer to do psychedelics, that's already a narrowly restricted class of society. They may well be people who are influenced by Buddhism or some kind of New Age thinking right at the outset. I think it's actually a drawback to psychedelic studies that you have to give a very thorough briefing to those who are going to undertake things. Experience. You have to tell them a lot about what has typically happened. So they're going to be fed a whole lot of beliefs as to what to expect. And I think that that's ethically required, but it makes the results slightly less interesting. So I think the people who've had spontaneous experiences are in some ways a more interesting group of people to investigate. And then, of course, you can quiz them as to what their previously existing beliefs were, and to see what extent that influences the experience that they report.
We've got something online here, sorry. How do you, this is from someone, how do you imagine the way in which you would conduct studies on mystical experiences, the questions you pose to the subjects involved, change if you adopted a panpsychist theory of consciousness?
Well, if the experimenter adopted that panpsychist theory of consciousness, or the person being experimented on, those are two separate questions. I would hope that the experiment would be conducted in a way that is completely independent of the beliefs of the experimenter. So what you'd have to do with the person being experimented on is to try to get as clear a portrait as you can of their pre-existing beliefs. So whether it's panpsychism or not, or some other belief, to see what kinds of shifts there are. And this is one of the things that the Timmerman study did. He specifically looked at panpsychism and saw a general tendency for panpsychist beliefs to grow or to increase as a result of the experiment. But also, interestingly, they didn't last quite so long. I mean, here we've got 4 weeks and 6 months. And the non-physicalistic beliefs as a package, the effects seem to endure. Actually, as you see, there are two slopes. After 6 months, and you don't get quite such a powerful effect for the non-physicalistic beliefs. But with panpsychism, there was discovered to be a greater falling off of changes to panpsychist beliefs after that 6-month period as opposed to the 4 weeks. So maybe that's an interesting result.
Why would that be, I wonder?
Yeah.
You can only speculate, I suppose.
Mm.
Could it be that people are falling back into a sort of metaphysical ideology of the culture where panpsychism is, frowned upon, perhaps?
One could say that about any of the possible beliefs.
Well, except for physicalism, perhaps. In England, that would be, or in the West. Any other questions? Okay, well, let's thanks Noa Latham.